Amazing reunion. Millionaire discovers hidden twins in a supermarket. Incredible transformation. Bob Anderson had spent the better part of his life climbing the ladders of wealth and success. But today, amidst the fluorescent lights of the local supermarket, an unsettling realization gripped him. Surrounded by families laughing and tying shopping carts to their wristbands, he felt like an outsider in his own life. Each aisle was a stark contrast to the glass and marble spaces he inhabited. Here, the smell of bread and fresh produce filled the air, invoking memories of simpler times he had long abandoned. The noise of chattering children felt like a distant echo of his own childhood, one he had forfeited in his relentless pursuit of power. Each step he took felt heavier, suffocated by the weight of his success. And as he reached for a box of cereal, a surge of disconnection rattled him. It was then, amid the ordinary, that he spotted them. Two teenagers, scrappy and wide-eyed, flipping through discount groceries as if hunting for gold. Intrigued, he approached. His heart raced as their laughter took him back decades, igniting a flicker of something long forgotten. The excitement, the camaraderie, the bond of family. But that flicker dimmed quickly as their conversation hinted at a world far beyond his towering walls. A familial resemblance tugged at Bob's mind, like an uninvited thought, forcing its way to the forefront. "Where are you from?" he asked, allowing curiosity to supersede his initial hesitancy. In the softness of their replies, Bob's polished life felt increasingly hollow. When Jess and Jamie began to explain their struggles, the gritty reality of their existence struck him like lightning. The truth spilled out in fragments, a tale of poverty, separation, and rejection that resonated deeply within him. His breathing grew irregular as he grappled with a truth he had only subconsciously feared. They were his twins, siblings he never knew existed. Before we continue, I need to tell you about something important that's happening. YouTube has been making changes to the system, and many people are losing notifications from channels they follow. If you're enjoying the content, click the bell and mark all notifications so you don't miss the next videos. And if you can leave a like, it really helps with reach. Seriously, it makes a difference. Oh, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know who's on the other side of the screen. Now let's continue. Bob stood on the precipice of a moral dilemma greater than any business deal he had ever fathomed. He donned the cloak of his identity as an entrepreneur, a guardian of success. Yet the hollow gaze of his newfound siblings stripped that away. How could he claim to love family while ignoring theirs? And yet, the whispers in the aisles, the doubts of his perceived intent weighed heavily on him. Charity or brotherhood? As he extended his hand, a promise to support their dreams, he could feel the stares burning into his back. The elite circle he had crafted for himself now viewed him as a pariah. Would they still embrace him as their own when they saw him standing beside his struggling siblings? Would the tight grasp of societal prejudice tighten further around him? The thought reeked of desperation. The task of reconciling with Jess and Jamie seemed insurmountable, standing in stark contrast to the empire he built. The noise of the supermarket faded, leaving only the thudding of his heart and the gnawing emptiness within. How far had he strayed from the boy who once chased laughter and family with open arms? As he left the store, the future hung uncertain, shadows dancing ominously around him, igniting a storm within that begged to be calmed. But could he confront the chaos of his past before it swallowed him whole? In that moment, Bob Anderson knew he was about to embark on the hardest journey of his life, one where love and ambition would clash with the darkness of history, and only time would reveal whether it was worth losing everything for something unquantifiable. The ties that bind. As Bob stepped into the frigid air outside the supermarket, each breath felt sharp against his skin, as if the world were trying to remind him he was still alive. He had craved success for so long, but the intoxicating thrill of acquisitions and deals had dulled. Now, he was confronted with the raw, wrenching reality of his own failings. The laughter of Jess and Jamie echoed in his ears, a haunting yet welcome sound that reminded him of cherished moments he had pushed aside in favor of ambition. With a jolt of determination, Bob knew he couldn't let this encounter fade into a mere memory. If he was to redefine what family truly meant to him, he had to act. Taking a seat in his lavishly appointed car, he fished out his phone, fingers trembling as he debated how to initiate contact. What could he possibly say to two teenagers with lives so different from his own? He envisioned the crestfallen looks on their faces if he failed to reach out. He took a deep breath and dialed the number he'd hastily scribbled on a napkin. The phone rang, each sound resonating in him like the ticking of a clock counting down to his awakening. When Jamie answered, the carefree tone instantly shifted to surprise. Bob introduced himself, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. Stumbling through words, he managed to express not only his desire to connect, but also a genuine promise to be present. "Let's meet again," he suggested, heart quickening as he awaited their response. To his relief, Jess and Jamie agreed, their voices echoing a mix of hope and uncertainty that mirrored his own. As they arranged a time, excitement mingled with dread within Bob. Would they truly accept him? Could they ever see through his wealth to the vulnerable man underneath? This rendezvous was not about charity. It was about forging connections he'd neglected for too long. The reality of those words washed over him like cold water. He was stepping into uncharted territory. Days passed like molasses as Bob prepared for their meeting. He began to confront his past, sifting through memories and emotions he had buried deep. He read self-help books on reconciling family estrangement, reflecting on what it meant to nurture relationships instead of merely strategizing. Each night he fought against the urge to resort to old habits, putting his work before everything, excusing himself from the emotional honesty that awaited him ahead. Finally, the day arrived. As Bob waited at the cafe they selected, he faced the nagging fear of isolation that had plagued him since childhood, fears that expressed his worry that they could never forgive a father who had abandoned them. But this was not simply about addressing his mistakes. It was about his transformation. It had shifted from purely about financial aid to a bond that would potentially reshape his identity, one he had to earn. When Jess and Jamie walked in, he was struck by how they illuminated the mundane space with their presence. For the first time in years, he genuinely wanted to extract meaning from life beyond profit margins and stock reports. As they exchanged initial pleasantries and hesitation, he caught a glimpse in their eyes, a mix of curiosity and protection, two people wary of the man they had only just discovered. The conversation began tentatively, but beneath the surface, an unspoken connection began to spark. Bob realized that with each question he asked, each vulnerability he showcased, he was peeling layers away from both himself and them. He saw the potential for a new life, one woven with honesty and accountability. But as the evening wore on, unanticipated confrontation flooded the space. Unresolved emotions surged forward, creating a palpable tension that filled the air around their small table, knotting Bob's stomach. Could he become a true brother in their eyes? Or would he remain just a shadow of missed opportunities? Bob's future began to unfurl with dizzying speed, and he felt the impact of his choices surge. The consequences of what was discussed would reverberate through not only his life, but Jess and Jamie's as well. Would this meeting transform all their lives for the better, or set them on a collision course of disarray? As Bob prepared for the plunge into deeper discussions, it dawned on him. Confronting the ghosts of his past was merely the beginning of a much larger, heart-racing journey. Would he find the strength to overcome his struggles for a real relationship, or fall back into the patterns of isolation that had defined him for years? With each tick of the clock in the cafe, he felt time slipping away, and one thought loomed larger than the rest. This wasn't just about family anymore. It was about his very soul. How far was he willing to go to redefine his legacy? The tension at the small cafe reached its zenith, enveloping Bob in a haze of apprehension and unresolved fear. He glanced at Jess and Jamie, feeling how their unspoken questions simmered just beneath the surface. Each moment stretched like an eternity, demanding answers that churned inside him, begging for release. As he leaned forward, The stark reality of their plight hit him harder than he anticipated. "I know I haven't been the father you deserved," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I walked away for reasons I thought were valid at the time, but I can see now how selfish I was. I want to understand you both, and I want you to understand me." The weight of his admission lingered, filling the air with a heavy mixture of hope and challenge. For a fleeting moment, their expressions softened. Was this the opening he yearned for? Jess broke the silence, her brow furrowed as she sought to absorb his sincerity. "You think saying sorry will fix everything?" Her words were sharp, but behind them lay an earnest questioning, leaving room for dialogue, for exploration. Bob grappled with that question. Yes, he had fallen back on apologies throughout his life when confronted with discomfort. But this was different. He wasn't about to rely on empty reassurances. No, it's not just about the apology. It's about committing to be here, to genuinely listen to you both. Even as he spoke, doubt seeped into his mind. Did he possess the tools needed for such complex emotional labor? The fear of inadequacy loomed large. Jamie shifted in his seat, visibly torn. "You come here with your suit and your fancy car like it means something. But what does that really make you? A successful businessman? You have no idea what we've been through." His voice faltered slightly, though the weight of his emotions was palpable, raw and urgent. Bob felt the truth of that statement hit home. This confrontation made him realize he had a choice: rehash a reassuring narrative to pacify them, or dive into vulnerability that could fuel a real connection. "Let me show you who I am beyond my bank account or my career. I want to get to know the people you've become, not just the children I left behind." With each word, he felt an unfamiliar surge of courage. Raw, unfiltered honesty was his best asset now. The landscape of the conversation shifted. The room had transitioned from a battlefield to fertile ground for growth. Jess furrowed her brow, and Jamie leaned in, curiosity edging out wariness. "Then tell us what you've actually done since everything fell apart," Jess prompted. Bob's heart pounded, suddenly faced with the urgency to break down the facade he had sharpened in business meetings. "I buried myself in work, thinking success would fill the void," he admitted. "But it didn't. I faced loss, emptiness. I drank to numb it. I pursued wealth to distract myself from the chaos inside." The act of admitting this was a revelation, a commitment to authenticity that could alter the course of their encounter. As he opened up, he discovered another layer of his identity. A man who had endured, and, in doing so, harbored the potential to connect with Jess and Jamie through struggle rather than success. Yet he felt the hollow echoes of his own past failures constantly, a reminder of the fragility of life. How many more conversations could emerge from this single moment? He recognized the depth of the journey ahead, both as a father and an individual seeking redemption. The chair creaked under the shifting dynamics of their conversation. Uncertainty washed over him, but Bob dared to envision the possibility of a growing bond, one forged over shared narratives instead of distant corporate strategies. "Can we talk about starting over?" he finally asked, his vulnerability hanging in the air like a whispered promise. Just as hope began to take root, a shrill notification pierced the moment. Bob's phone buzzed violently on the table, shattering the focused connection they had begun to build. He fumbled to silence it, his heart racing for another reason now. Distraction emerged, echoing a deeper conflict. Were outside forces trying to reclaim him, to drown out the bond he desperately sought to create? With resolve settling in his chest, Bob glanced at his children. No, not just his children. His hope. This was the moment he had been fighting for. But as he watched their expressions harden, he couldn't shake the feeling that this fragile flower of connection could wilt as quickly as it had begun. He was on a precipice, and the fall might be worse than he could imagine. Would they accept his newfound commitment to be present, or would the barriers built through neglect and misunderstanding prove insurmountable? As tension crackled between past and future, Bob sensed a turning point was near. But first, he would have to confront the one thing he feared most, himself. What awaited him in the darkness of that discovery? The moment hung thick in the air, each heartbeat echoing Bob's uncertainty. The pall of the buzzing phone faded into the background as he focused on Jess and Jamie. In that instant, he felt the responsibility of fatherhood weigh heavily on his shoulders, and a peculiar clarity cut through the fog of past distractions. It wasn't that they had to forgive him immediately, but there was a flicker of possibility, a chance to redefine their narrative. "Look," he began, his voice more composed now. "I get that I can't just waltz in and expect everything to change overnight. I've been a ghost in your lives when I should have been your anchor. All I ask is for the chance to prove that I can be better, not just for you, but for me as well." Jess's skepticism simmered just beneath the surface, while Jamie's crossed arms signaled defiance. But in their eyes, Bob recognized something new. Cautious curiosity. It invigorated him. He had embarked on this journey aiming for reconciliation. But what if this was also a journey of self-reclamation? "I want to understand who you both are now," he said, leaning in slightly. "I can't pretend to claim the title of father unless I truly know my children." The truth of that statement coursed through him like a spark. He needed to become part of their narrative, learning their stories instead of reciting his own. The air shifted palpably. Bob felt a ripple of tension ease as he saw Jess visibly relaxing, albeit slightly. Jamie remained tense, but there was a flicker of intrigue beneath his guarded exterior. Bob could feel something growing, a tentative thread forming between them, one he knew would be delicate and require nurturing. "I've lost a lot more than time," he pressed on, wrestling with the weight of memories that both haunted and transformed him. "I've lost who I am. I've spent so long hiding behind this image of success, but it hasn't brought me happiness." The fear of opening old wounds hung in the air. "I want to be real with you," he continued, "even if that means showing my failures first." The vulnerability settled around him like a shield. This was both a risk and a necessity. The cafe surrounded them, a world filled with chatter and laughter, strangers oblivious to the monumental shift happening in their little corner. As Bob looked down at his hands, his thoughts raced. The earlier bravado began to be replaced with an urgent longing. Could he navigate through the uncomfortable reality that lay ahead? His children deserved more than a hollow father's face. Jess broke the silence, her voice steady, but edged with emotion. "So, what happens next? You want to be present, but how do we know it's not just another business deal for you?" Bob processed her words carefully. This wasn't merely a transaction for him, but an opportunity to engage fully with their lives. "I can't promise perfection, but I can promise effort. And if I fail, I want you to hold me accountable." Jess exchanged glances with Jamie, a silent communication that Bob couldn't decipher. Was it trust? Skepticism? A reminder of the walls that had grown taller over the years? "Okay," Jamie finally said, his voice a mix of hesitation and agreement. "Show us. You can start by working on yourself. That's where it all begins anyway." Their words sounded simple, yet laden with complexity. Bob understood this wasn't just about the past, but navigating forward in an unseen future fraught with challenges. The pace of his heartbeat quickened as he recognized the terrain ahead was unknown. What kind of father would he become? What would it take to dismantle years of hurt and rebuild a relationship from the ground up? Just as a fresh confidence began to bloom within him, his phone buzzed again, breaking the fragile atmosphere once more. This time, he didn't have to check the screen. It could wait. The lessons from the past were pressing, demanding his attention instead. But what if this time they weren't distractions to sabotage his attempt to reconnect? What if they were signals guiding him toward the truth he needed for both himself and his children? Would he have the courage to face the answers lurking within? As he took a deep breath, Bob felt the weight of those questions settle upon him. The road to redemption would not be easy, but he would have to risk everything to finally understand who he truly was. In that moment, clarity struck. This was not just about reconnecting with Jess and Jamie. It was about confronting all the pieces of himself he had neglected for so long. And then, as if on cue, a familiar name flashed across the screen. A name buried deep in his past, but suddenly significant in the context of his present. An old business partner. A ghost from the life he was trying to escape. What could they want? How would this complicate his already fraught journey? The question echoed in his mind as he weighed the implications of an unresolved past. Fear wrapped around Bob like a vice as the name flickered on his screen. Mark Halston. Memories surged back, uninvited and unsettling. Their partnership had once been powerful, driven by ambition, but it had also spiraled into something toxic, marred by trust issues and greed. Mark had embodied everything that Bob had fought against in his attempts to reclaim his life. He hesitated, torn between the looming call of his neglected professional life and the delicate moment with Jess and Jamie that felt organic and raw. His instinct told him to ignore the call, to reject that chapter of his life entirely. But the entanglement of his past and present was becoming increasingly convoluted. As Jess and Jamie sat across from him, their expressions a mixture of uncertainty and mild encouragement, he could hear Mark's voice, persuasive and eager, in his head. What if this was a trap? A way to pull him back into a world that had diminished him? But what if it also held an opportunity for redemption, of a different sort? Are you going to get that? Jess's voice punctuated his thoughts, laced with a hint of impatience. Catching the glimmer of concern in her eyes, it dawned on him that perhaps she felt a similar weight, a fear of being abandoned again. The realization committed him to the moment. No, Bob replied, placing the phone face down on the table as if it were a hot iron. Whatever that is, it can wait. Right now, I am here. Hearing those words felt like a promise, albeit a fragile one. Jess nodded slowly, and in that small action, the bond between them grew slightly stronger, as if a shared agreement had just formed. Okay then, Jamie said, a flicker of respect breaking through his earlier skepticism. What's next? Bob glanced between them, feeling the weight of their expectation pressing down on him. It was time to draw on his newfound resolve. Let's talk about how we can get to know each other. I want to hear about your lives, what you love, what you're passionate about. The ensuing conversation began as a hesitant exploration, stories shared softly, edges smoothed by cautious curiosity. Bob listened intently, absorbing their tales of school, friends, and aspirations. Each word was a thread drawing them closer, weaving a tapestry of connection that had been abandoned for too long. As they exchanged laughter and sometimes uncomfortable memories, Bob could sense the shift in dynamics. There was no longer a chasm of lost time, but rather an invitation to explore the uncharted territory of togetherness. Yet deep inside, a familiar tension began to coil. The unresolved implications of Mark's call lingered, like a shadow at the periphery of his consciousness. What if Mark needed something urgent? What if he tried to leverage their past relationship to sabotage Bob's newfound momentum? The uneasy implications would not leave him. Just as the conversation shifted to music, that deep passion of Jess's that brought her to life more than ever, his phone buzzed once more. Bob fought the urge to glance down, fearing its implications. The freedom he was fighting for seemed fragile, dangling by an unseen thread, and he couldn't afford to risk it. Focus, he whispered to himself. This wasn't the time to let distractions cloud his progress. I need to stay present, but the struggle within him was escalating. How could he embrace this potential reconciliation while an urgent call from his past echoed in his mind? Feeling the weight of his own internal discord, he shifted the conversation. Okay, what about hobbies? What do you both do when you want to escape? As they launched into shared interests once more, discussions of music bands, movies, and sports, the weight of the world seemed to lighten. For an instant, hope flickered, painting a future that felt tangible. But would that flicker last? And what of the looming uncertainty that Mark presented? The path ahead could split in unforeseen directions, and Bob could feel the tension intensifying, the need for him to confront the past pulling at his heels. The moment of clarity he'd experienced before was now contorted by doubt. Was the pursuit of fatherhood going to clash irreversibly with the ghosts of his professional obligations? As Jess and Jamie shared laughter, their voices carrying warmth and eagerness, something inside Bob shifted again. Would he have the courage to stand firm, or would the echoes of his entrepreneurial spirit draw him back into a world he'd fought so hard to leave? Perhaps it was time to answer that call. The question of whether he could balance his dual quest for fatherhood and professional redemption hung heavily in the air, unresolved. The moment he felt ready to drift back into their shared laughter, his phone buzzed insistently again. Did the past have the power to intrude on this fragile present he was trying to build? With his heart racing, he couldn't help but wonder if this would be the last moment before everything he was trying to forge crumbled before him. Familiar dread brushed against his resolve. Would he finally confront Mark and the questions that lay within, or allow the past to shatter the potential his children now represented? Time was ticking, and he was caught between two worlds. The lines were drawn. Commitment was calling. Would he walk away once more, or seize the challenge head-on? The laughter subsided, but the warmth lingered like a fresh embrace. For a fleeting moment, Bob felt anchored in this newfound reality, a refreshing contrast to the looming darkness that Mark's name summoned. The buzz of his phone was an unwelcome interjection against the backdrop of a fragile connection he was trying to solidify. He needed to act, to ground himself, and yet that nagging call from his past lingered. Bob took a deep breath, focusing on Jess and Jamie. Their faces, flushed with the joy of connection, reminded him of the stakes. It could very well be his choice right now to shape the future he desired. "What did you want to be when you grew up?" Bob asked suddenly, redirecting the energy in the room. Both of them traded glances, a silent dialogue flaring as curiosity began to overshadow their trepidation. It felt like a small victory, a step toward forging something real. Jess launched into a story about wanting to be an astronaut. Her enthusiasm radiated, and for a moment, that pure ambition washed away the remnants of Bob's internal struggle. "That's amazing. What about you, Jamie?" Bob shifted his gaze, eager to draw the boy out. "I wanted to be a professional gamer," Jamie confessed, his voice punctuated by a hint of pride and embarrassment. "I used to spend hours playing every weekend." As each shared dream unfolded, Bob realized this wasn't just about light-hearted conversation. It was an exploration of identity, both theirs and his. This connection was becoming his tether, and he felt the boundaries of the past beginning to blur. It struck him then. If he could nurture their passions, perhaps he could nurture his own. The notion gave way to a flicker of resolve, empowering him to step cautiously toward the heart of the conflict brewing within. Could he balance his aspirations with fatherhood? The air shifted as he shared his experiences, aiming to instill in them the lessons learned from failure, something he had often wished someone had passed on to him. "You know, I once had a dream to create something that would help people," he began slowly, recognizing the weight of truth in vulnerability. "Really? What happened?" Jess asked, her eyes bright with interest. "Most of it fell apart due to bad choices and the wrong partnerships. But what matters," he asserted, his voice gaining strength, "is what I learned from that. Regrets can teach you the biggest lessons." As he watched them absorb his words, a certainty set in. He was forging a new path, one that could merge the lessons of his tumultuous past with the hopes he held for the future. But there was Mark, always there at the fringes, reminding him of the counterpart of that ambition, the risk of losing himself again. His phone buzzed yet again, the sound echoing like a judgment against the promise he wanted to cement with his children. He hesitated, the walls of his composure beginning to close in. "I'll be right back," he said, slicing through the ambiance with a note of urgency. Forcing himself to stand, he walked toward the adjoining room, the vibrations of the unresolved gnawing harder at his gut than before. This conversation, it dawned on him, had the potential to shift everything. His focus, his future, and the chance to reshape his place in this family knot he was trying to build. In that solitary space, claustrophobic thoughts battled in his mind. Was this call from Mark worth risking the fragile connection he was developing? What more did he want from him? Each unanswered question felt like a vice tightening around his heart. With the weight of his children's laughter retreating along the hall, Bob took a breath, forcing determination into his veins. "I need to do this," he whispered to himself, a rallying cry. As he turned back toward the laughter and life he was trying to cultivate, clarity dawned. If he could face Mark, learn what he really wanted, maybe he could frame that encounter as an opportunity, not an obligation. But could he do that without losing this chance that felt so precious? The buzzing intensified in his pocket, a reminder of the lurking shadows, urging him to make a decision. What awaited him on the other side of this call? Was the past an adversary, or could it become a stepping stone toward a more profound reconciliation? As anxiety and resolve danced in a precarious balance, he felt something unshakable within, a growing urge to take control. Bob stood at the threshold, heart thumping in anticipation. Would he reclaim his narrative, or would he risk it all in a confrontation fraught with peril? The call was waiting, as was the undefined promise of fatherhood. He took a final breath, preparing to leap into uncertainty. The moment of truth had arrived. The choice lay in his hands. Would he answer that call, or choose to cultivate the life blossoming before him? Standing alone in the dim light of the adjoining room, Bob's heart raced faster than usual. He felt the air grow heavier with the weight of his decision. The laughter of Jess and Jamie, vibrant and cheerful, echoed faintly against the wall, each peal reminding him of what he stood to lose if he chose poorly. The buzzing from his phone became a relentless drumbeat, echoing reminders of a past he thought he could leave behind. He had come to a juncture in his life, a moment where he could either retreat into the shadows of his history or step boldly into a future he had dared to dream about. Bob glanced down at the phone, hesitating, his thumb hovering over the screen. The name Mark blared in neon against the backdrop of his worries. It felt like fate, a confrontation with someone who had once played a significant role in his life. Yet now, the thought of it churned something deep in his stomach. What would Mark want? And why was he suddenly eager to talk after all this time? Anger mixed with curiosity, but underneath it all was a simpler, almost childlike fear. Bob didn't want to revisit the uncertainty of old wounds. He wanted to focus on his children, on what it meant to build a family, to become the parent he had once wished he could be. This past connection taunted him like an old ghost, threatening to ruin the delicate web of trust he was weaving with Jess and Jamie. Taking another steadying breath, Bob turned slightly, positioning himself so that he could keep an eye on the living room where the two children were still lost in laughter. He could envision their futures, bright and unblemished. The thought filled him with determination. Would answering the call lead to bitter disputes, or could it forge a path of understanding? A lingering image of those two hopeful faces urged him onward. "Be honest," he muttered under his breath, "but don't let him take away everything you've just built." Slowly, he tapped the screen to accept the call, tension mounting as the phone connected. "Hey, it's Bob," he said, his voice steady but low, like he was drawing a line in the sand. "Bob, it's good to hear from you." Mark's voice was deceptively warm, coated in charm. But beneath that veneer, Bob sensed the unmistakable currents of manipulation that had characterized their previous interactions. Yeah, you too. What's going on? Bob replied, fighting to maintain a casual tone. An internal battle raged between his hope for genuine interaction and his instinctual wariness. I've been thinking about our last project. I know things didn't end the best for us, but I see a way we could collaborate again. Something big, Bob. We could make it work this time, Mark said, confidence oozing through the phone screen. The words left a bitter aftertaste in Bob's mouth. Collaboration? It felt like a word soaked with unfulfilled promises and bitter disappointments. Before he could respond, Mark pressed on. I know that dream you mentioned the other night. What if we could revive it? There's potential here, a real chance to succeed if we work together. Bob looked back toward the living room, feeling a brief surge of defiance. I'm not sure I want to play that game anymore, he said, his voice firmer now. I'm focusing on my family and what's important. Don't say you'd throw away all that potential just for a few bumps in the road. We're talking about success, Bob. Real success. The tension spiked. Did Mark think he could still influence him? The temptation remained potent, reminding Bob just how easily ambition could blind a person to their own values. The chaos of his previous life beckoned, but it was tempered by the vivid images of laughter and connection in the other room. I need to think about this, Bob said finally, catching himself before he fell back into Mark's manipulative trap. Fine, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait. The call ended abruptly, leaving Bob staring at the phone, bewildered by the conflicting sentiments swirling within him. A fresh wave of clarity surged through him. He now understood what he needed to do. Bob stepped back, slowly re-entering the warmth of the living room. As Jess and Jamie noticed him, their smiles ignited something inside rather than fading ghosts from his past. Standing on the precipice of his own potential, he knew he needed to protect this newfound purpose from his old life's siren call. The moment felt pivotal. What's next? He thought, aware that he could shape the narrative for himself and his children. As he rejoined the laughter, Bob felt a shift within himself, determined to prioritize what mattered. Yet the specter of Mark still lingered, a reminder that the battles he fought didn't just lie in the past. The real conflict awaited. What would he choose? The familiar allure of ambition that had once led him astray, or the uncharted territory of fatherhood and genuine connection? Guided by his new resolve, he knew his next steps were crucial. The call with Mark had merely set the stage. This time would be different. In the following days, Bob placed a conscious effort into maintaining the laughter-filled atmosphere he'd cultivated with Jess and Jamie. Each moment felt like a rehearsal for a role he was still learning to play. He found himself more involved, stepping beyond the casual interactions that had once defined his parenting. He accompanied Jess to her dance class, clapping enthusiastically as she twirled with uncontained joy, each movement a reminder of childhood's untarnished spirit. With Jamie, he set up intricate Lego constructions, sharing stories of imaginary lands. These fragments of their lives became the anchor for his purpose, the calibration for his moral compass. Yet, deep within, the resonance of Mark's voice continued to echo, taunting him with the allure of success that now felt foreign. As evenings passed, Bob's mental landscape remained tumultuous. He wrestled with memories of Mark, their past partnership that had skyrocketed to great heights, fueled by ambition, but ultimately soured by betrayal. Thoughts of unfinished business lingered. A part of him resented the unsettling hold Mark had on his ambition, but another part hungered for validation. Was it possible to venture into those waters again and stay afloat? During one particularly quiet moment, Jess burst into the living room, an excited grin plastered across her face. Dad, can I show you something? She led him to her craft table. There, she revealed a drawing, an expansive scene crowded with stick figures enjoying a picnic, the sun beaming overhead, trees swaying peacefully. This is our family, she announced, eyes sparkling. Bob's heart clenched. The simplicity of it cut deeper than he anticipated. Jess believed in a version of their family that held them together through artistry and laughter. He felt the urge to expand that vision further. But would it shatter with the re-entry of Mark into his life? The following day, Bob ventured out, deliberately steering clear of the places he habitually frequented that echoed his past. Instead, he enrolled in a local community parenting workshop, a space dedicated to nurturing relationships. This decision gnawed at him. It didn't bring the same rush as a business venture, but it felt more fulfilling. Each session unveiled layers and tactics for better communication, skills he wished to adopt. However, as the days morphed into weeks, the temptation to reach out to Mark crackled in the back of his mind. The project they had discussed lingered, a tantalizing possibility that felt like a cigarette held under a flame, one he could combust with a reckless move. The thought of how easy it would be to reclaim that life and the whisper of accolades fueled his internal conflict. But at what cost? Think, he reminded himself one evening, retreating into a quiet corner. What do you want? It was a question that struck him, its simplicity deceptive. He couldn't dissolve the desire for recognition from his past self. Yet another voice, one that resembled the laughter of Jess and Jamie, urged him toward a clearer future. The next morning, after wrestling with his thoughts through the night, Bob decided to call Mark. Dialing the familiar number felt like stepping onto a crumbling bridge, one he feared might give way beneath his feet. As the phone rang, he hesitated, grappling with a visceral sensation of dread mixed with exhilaration. Tomorrow, he whispered to himself, steeling his resolve. Tomorrow I'll confront him, but on my terms. As he hung up, the decision settled over him like a cool breath of air, both liberating and suffocating. In that moment, he realized he stood at the cusp of his future. He maintained the potential to not only reclaim his ambitions, but to redefine them within the framework of his family. And as the day melted into dusk, Bob felt a flicker of confidence ignite amidst the uncertainty. The journey he had begun was shaping him, urging him to confront the past while firmly grasping the present. Yet something strange lingered in the air, a sense of imminent change. Was he prepared for the confrontation with Mark? New uncertainties twisted in his gut. The moment of truth loomed ahead, promising to test his commitment to his new life and his burgeoning sense of self. Would he stand tall against the past? Or would he slip back into a dance he thought he had left behind? The morning arrived, drenched in a crispness that only early spring could offer. Yet the air felt oppressive to Bob. The remnants of last night's exerted self-discovery still echoed in his mind. He had been through a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, and this day would either mark a new beginning or push him perilously back into the shadows of his past. Bob sipped his coffee slowly, its warmth grounding him while his thoughts danced between anticipation and dread. He glanced at the clock, its relentless ticking feeling like a countdown to a decisive moment. What would he say to Mark? Would he convey the scar that their partnership had left, or the strength he had found in vulnerability? It was a duality he could not ignore, and yet the task ahead felt monumental. As he prepared for the confrontation, Bob chose his ground carefully, steeling himself for the potential fallout. He opted for a neutral location, a cafe where they had often conducted business meetings, a bittersweet reminder of the past they once shared, but a safer environment to speak candidly, without the weight of familiarity clouding their discussion. Arriving early, he settled at a corner table, the aroma of roasted coffee mingling with memories of laughter and calculated ambition. Each sip heightened his unease, yet it also offered clarity as he envisioned his strategy. He would approach this encounter with a clear outline of his intentions. He would not allow Mark to commandeer his narrative or manipulate him into old roles. This was about reclamation and growth. As he waited, flashes of his recent time spent with Jess and Jamie reassured him. The joy they shared, the genuine connections he'd fostered, provided a steady undercurrent against Mark's volatile legacy. He had been shaping a new chapter, and yet the looming darkness of the past threatened to envelop him once again. When Mark finally walked in, All familiarity washed over Bob like a tide as he assessed his former partner. The slight thinning of Mark's hair and the lines etched into his face spoke to the passage of time. Yet his sharpness, a smirk of confidence, the familiar threadbare charm, remained intact. "Bob?" Mark called, his voice like a caress cradling old tension. "Mark?" Bob responded, his heart racing as he offered a terse smile. They settled into an uneasy silence, the unspoken weight of their shared past pressing down. "What's this about?" Mark cut through it, his tone borderline confrontational. Bob inhaled deeply. "I think it's time we talked about what happened. About us." Mark leaned back, crossing his arms, his posture defensive. "Is this your way of saying you miss the glory days?" The bait, a typical Brad maneuver, tempted Bob momentarily. He was keenly aware of the manipulation, however. "No, this is about understanding what that glory cost us, and what I'm willing to reclaim now." The words hung in the air, charged with the authority he had been sculpting over weekends spent crafting Legos and dancing in joyous abandon. Surprise flickered across Mark's face. "You think you can step away from that? You think you can create some idyllic picture and I can just fade away?" Bob felt a jolt of certainty erupt within him. "It's not about fading away, Mark. It's about choosing to move forward, not back." A momentary pause enveloped them, laden with the unspoken truths neither had dared to voice before. Bob could see Mark grappling with the implications, defending himself against the reflection of choices made in haste, a partnership that had once glittered with potential but ultimately crumbled under betrayals and greed. Yet, as Mark's defenses began to falter, Bob sensed a new force rising within him. An urge to take control of this narrative, to not only reclaim his past, but to reshape it entirely. "You've changed, haven't you?" Mark asked, his voice an amalgam of skepticism and curiosity. "Change has been the only constant I've embraced," Bob answered, his voice weaving strength into his resolve. Just then, as if the universe itself reacted to his declaration, he noticed a young father struggling with a toddler at the cafe door, laughter erupting in the sharp juxtaposition of chaos and delight. The boy's glee consumed Bob's focus, striking a chord within him. "Bob, Mark began again, but the moment had shifted. "What's the point in clinging to the past if it stops us from enjoying the present?" Bob challenged, feeling an electric surge of clarity. Perhaps this was not just a confrontation, but a revelation. A chance to build something from the ashes, not just between him and Mark, but within himself. As Mark prepared to respond, a shift punctuated the air, a tension so thick Bob could barely breathe. The ground beneath them felt as if it could tilt, leading to unexpected outcomes neither had anticipated. Would this confrontation open the floodgates to a new partnership, or drown him in the depths of old schemes? The anticipation mounted. What unknowns lay ahead as they dissected their shared history? Would they rediscover their respective paths, or entangle themselves further in an old dance? The dynamic shifted when Mark leaned forward, a calculative fire igniting in his eyes. "You're right. We can't go back. But we can create something better, Bob. You know I have connections we can leverage." His charm and the allure of profit hung heavily in the air, mixing with the outside vibrations of laughter and simplicity. Yet Bob felt something else instead. The hopes he had nurtured with Jess and Jamie flickered in his mind, reminding him of what had truly mattered. "You think I care about connections?" he countered, his voice steady. "What I want is redemption. Real connections with my family, with my life. Not another chance to run the rat race." Mark's expression faltered, surprise marred by skepticism. An itch of desperation snaked its way into Bob's heart. Not for success, but for genuine validation. "This isn't about what you want from me anymore, Mark. This is about what I need to reclaim in myself." Was it arrogance or wisdom? Bob couldn't quite tell, but the clarity of that thought felt liberating, like a weight lifting. The intensity grew palpable. like static before a storm. Mark looked taken aback before his bravado tried to resurface. You honestly think you can just walk away from all that we built? You'll lose out if you do. His words dripped with the same anxiety Bob had once felt in the race for success. Maybe losing those ties is the necessary sacrifice, Bob replied, fueled by conviction. I've spent too much time stifled by guilt and expectations, trying to forge a path that was never mine. In that moment, it felt like the ground beneath them shook with the force of skillfully navigating a territory littered with shards of their shared past. Bob sensed a shift within himself, a strength rising from the ashes of uncertainty. This moment wasn't only about navigating Mark's influence, it was about vindicating everything he had unleashed in his new life with Jess and Jamie. I'm not going to allow you, or anyone, define my worth anymore, he proclaimed, feeling the rawness of his resolve embolden him. The words erupted, unlatching dreams once fastened shut beneath the weight of monetary pursuits. Here lay a person who had chosen vulnerability over pride, the moment blossoming between the two adversaries. Would Mark recognize the metamorphosis of the man he had once known? Mark's brow furrowed. Uncertainty hovered around him like fog, wrapping them both in the ambiguity of their history. You think you can just turn your back and move on? It's not that simple, Bob, he argued earnestly, as if wrestling the truths weighing on his heart. Bob breathed, mirroring Mark's intensity with fierce composure. I don't want it to be simple, Mark. I want it to be meaningful. I'm at a point in my life where I refuse to be the ghost of my own ambitions. Family matters more than the allure of old projects and accolades. And with those words, an undeniable crack began to form in the armored shell Mark had wrapped around himself. In that vulnerable, intense confessional, it felt like both men were standing at the threshold of redemption. The bustling cafe around them faded as if granting them room to breathe without pretense. Mark finally leaned back, regarding Bob with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Is it really possible? He asked softly, the remnants of his bravado slipping. It is, Bob replied, his voice firm yet compassionate. But it's not about us making that possibility happen together. This time, I need to prioritize my children above old dreams. The truth settled over them like a mist, illuminating the future not as a close-ended chapter, but rather an open canvas stretching out before them. As Mark held his gaze, the realization of 4 years lost in ambition dulled beneath possibilities. So, you're really ready to give up the life we had? I'm ready to create a new one. With every word, Bob felt lighter, surrendering the chains of his past, recognizing how liberation was intricately entwined with understanding. And for the first time, it feels right. In silence, they occupied their respective worlds, a palpable tension crackling between past regrets and future possibilities. Bob realized he had successfully begun to dismantle the barriers his ambition once imposed on him, while reconstructing a solid foundation for the new relationships he was forging with his children. I don't know if I fully understand, Mark conceded, his voice now tinged with a mix of regret and respect. But if this is really what you want, I can't stop you. Just know, you might miss opportunities that could have been incredible. I'm willing to take that risk, Bob asserted, finally finding solace in the proclamations he had yearned to express. Their conversation drifted toward the mundane, as they slowly began to explore the edges of their former partnership's quiet goodbye. The allure of that collaborative past began to dissolve like sugar in water, leaving behind a faint sweetness, but not the weight of obligation. Bob found himself absorbing the moment, recognizing how it signified a monumental shift. This encounter wasn't merely a conversation between partners, but an essential self-affirmation, a showcase of personal growth that marked where he stood now. The dialogue functioned not only as closure, but also as a symbolic breaking free from the chains of old expectations that defined success. The prior tension began to dissipate, revealing an unexpected calm. He was actively evading shadows, embracing the vibrancy of his chosen family over lost grandeur. The decision felt stunningly right, affording him a sense of depth and belonging he had always sought. As Bob left the cafe, a flood of emotions rushed through him. The laughter of Jess and Jamie filled every corner of his heart. The prior encounter with Mark, while pivotal, was simply another chapter in a story continually being rewritten. A chapter that left behind the past, one he could learn from but never repeat. With the sunlight warming his face, Bob stepped into the world armed with newfound purpose. He climbed into his car, relishing the promise of a future filled with the joys of fatherhood and authentic connections, gently weaving closer with his children. "Let's go home," he smiled softly to himself, the weight having finally lifted. The horizon ahead felt inviting, unfurling endless possibilities, with the laughter of family guiding him onward. No longer would he be ensnared by the compelling lure of unfulfilled ambition. It was the presence of authenticity that now illuminated the path ahead. As he drove through familiar streets, he realized how far he had come. He had faced the darkness, confronted his past, and made conscious decisions to embrace a brighter, more fulfilling future among those who truly mattered. This was his moment of awakening, and as it washed over him, he couldn't help but feel an immense surge of gratitude for growth, for setbacks that had led to revelations, and above all, for the harmonious future of family he envisioned building, together with Jess and Jamie. Now, it was time for them to explore this new chapter, a period grounded in real connections, where laughter reigned and love flourished over his former desires for glory. He relished the opportunity to share this journey, to create memories anchored in love. Life had become rich with purpose, and Bob Anderson was finally ready to embrace it. Heart and soul, aligned with those who filled his world with light. You need to subscribe now to catch the next exclusive emotional stories that will blow your mind. And you must leave a like now to feed the algorithm for even more heartwarming tales. Comment below your reactions or theories about Bob's incredible transformation, and share instantly this video with at least 5 friends who need to witness this inspiring conclusion. This is the moment to show your support. Don't wait even one more second to share. It's time to champion true stories of personal transformation.